Okay, so before we start, here's a statement for you. I'd like to go and see It Chapter 2, but the very existence of the scary movie franchise means that it's a bit pointless me going to see that film because I won't be scared. Now that would be an absurd leap of logic for any horror movie fan to make, wouldn't it? That would be literally absurd, because why would you connect the two when they're two separate things? So why on earth is it then that wrestling fans, certain pro wrestling fans, seem to want to apply that exact same logic to wrestling? So these certain fans who are galvanized by the old guard on Twitter to the point where they're literally using their language verbatim have decided that they want to denounce this notion that pro wrestling is an art form, that pro wrestling is performance art. Now these are the very same people who literally cosplay as Jim Cornette while bemoaning cosplay wrestlers alongside Jim Cornette. Now, you can see the problem here, right? Surely you can see that. But nevertheless, out they come in their droves. Motherfucker, it's not art, it's wrestling. Wrestlers should look like they could kill a guy in a real fight. Wrestling ain't flips and goofy gimmicks. It's a tough-looking good guy beating up a weasel of a heel. Yeah, muscles, masculinity and stuff. Now in fairness, this obviously stems from how wrestling used to operate. I mean, the WWF was considered to be too cartoonish, as was Memphis, in comparison to the sort of badass grit and technique that was being offered by Jim Crockett Promotions. But virtually every territory adhered strictly to kayfabe, the sort of idea that wrestling must be presented as a legitimate sport, as a legitimate enterprise, in order to get the money from the marks, who I guess really want to believe in it. And to be fair, that's how money used to be made in wrestling. That's what wrestling was all about. There was no real honor about it, and if there was, any of the honorable ones, well, they went out of business, sometimes multiple times in fact. As a result, some members of the old guard believe that this new niche generation of wrestling is scorching the earth for their successors who can never hope to be taken seriously in the wake of guys who touch cocks with their hands when those hands aren't wedged firmly in their pockets. Now this might be a well thought out argument, maybe even plausible too, were it not for the tiny insignificant fact that that actual statement is of course utter bollocks. Now let me back that up a little bit. In 2015, 4 years prior to this very recording, Joey Ryan invented the penisplex. Earth-shattering rage intensifies. In that very same year, Jay White was an emerging young lion in New Japan Pro Wrestling's dojo system, unrecognizable from his current Switchblade guys. MJF, meanwhile, was wrestling as Pete Lightning and Maxwell Jacob Feinstein in his debut year. And here we are in 2019, and both men are absolutely flourishing. Not just flourishing as wrestlers, but flourishing as true old-school type heels who can do promos so well that they can get an audience in the palm of their hand to the point of unanimous hatred. The frustrating part is that ultimately this debate is all a big tiresome omni-work. The old school podcasters moan about it to drive clicks, because the reality is that reminiscing over the halcyon days in the Mid-South Coliseum doesn't. And while that genuinely is a shame, it doesn't make it any less true. Meanwhile, you get attention-seeking fans who tag the likes of Cornette in a debate or a controversial topic, desperate for the recognition of a retweet. And even their supposed opponents in these online rivalries often angle their responses or reactions in the hope of getting over in the wrestling community as a rebel. Now, the irony, of course, to all of this is that when viewed through the optics of 2019, something like Arn Anderson's selling in the 80s is now looking fairly ridiculous and fairly comical in the modern era. Mr. Perfect would take these ridiculous rotating bumps. Broad slapstick was used as a comedic device to get over, even if nobody ever actually tried to punch their shadow in a quote-unquote real fight. That was used to get a pop from an audience who were much more earnest and much more easygoing, because back then, that was the currency. And in 2019, the currency has obviously changed. And in a time where sincerity is scary to many, it's these hyper-irony pops that seem to be the thing that fans are interested in, because you're dealing with a much more jaded public. Wrestling in 2019 is diverse, and honestly, what's wrong with that? Isn't a rigid structure exactly the reason why WWE draws so much criticism? Freedom of creative expression can manifest as anything, because that's exactly what it is. Wrestling always was performance art because it was never a fight. The matches were predetermined, the wrestlers were playing a character, so by definition, it was a performance. Acknowledging this didn't kill the business at Super Bowl VI in 1996. In fact, if anything, it was quite the opposite. The business just 2 years later exploded into life. In 2019, the concept of traditional wrestling performance is toyed with, it's parodied, it's subverted, and even more importantly, it's been perfected. And yeah, nobody's denying the fact that an old school veteran like Arn Anderson could probably knock the snot out of a new blood like Joey Janela. But by that exact same token, Minoru Suzuki would absolutely kick the horseman out of Arn Anderson, and that is a wrestler that you can still watch in a wrestling ring in 2019. You can watch Daniel Bryan scrape the faces off his opponents in matches that land perfectly in the Venn diagram of safety and credibility. You can watch Charlotte Flair straight up smack the life out of her opponents in some of the most physical WWE matches ever held. You can watch Hiroshi Tanahashi work matches so intricate and believable that every time his dragon screw makes you believe that he might just win a match, that is, not continue to enter a genius quote-unquote performance. Because while it obviously is a performance, it never feels like one in the moment. Equally though, yes, you can watch Orange Cassidy do one of the best suicide dives in the game with his hands in his goddamn pockets. You can watch that and all of these things without any one of them having to compromise the other one, no matter where you sit on the scales of wrestling. Now I should say, the counter argument isn't without some merit. A guy like Arn Anderson, who was awesome for his time, didn't destroy his own back so that some chancer can expose his painstaking work as a wry sham, but transgression is good. Transgression is vital. Some of the best art is produced when it's made in defiance of something. And you know what? If you hate that art, or you hate the very designation of art in wrestling, that's okay. That's totally fine, because at the end of the day, there is so much other wrestling that this one little subculture, this one little sub-industry within the industry doesn't have to destroy the seriousness of the business if that indeed is your thing. One doesn't have to ruin the other. They can kind of work alongside each other. But even if you subscribe to a different opinion, just look at New Japan Pro Wrestling's G1 Climax. If wrestling isn't supposed to be flips and goofy gimmicks, if it's supposed to be a tough-looking good guy beating up a weasel of a heel, then Kota Ibushi and Jay White recaptured and perfected that ideal in their blistering all-time great in the G1's final in August this very year. Ibushi entered the match with a weakened ankle and, as you can probably imagine, the heel White relentlessly attacked the ankle and completely decimated it throughout the match. And of course, Ibushi sold like a goddamn dream. White cut off every hopeless and brave comeback by Ibushi, and he did it with a perfectly timed viciousness. Time and time again, completely crushing any hope for an Ibushi comeback. And while he was doing it, he did the whole goddamn thing with a shit-eating grin on his face. And absolutely nobody, not one person in that sold-out Budokan Hall gave a single flying about the fact that Kota Ibushi once had a wrestling match with an inflatable doll. Instead, their screams for an Ibushi comeback were deafening as he slowly clawed his way back into the match. They'd been worked into this state by two masters under the most classic of dynamics, and this match, unlike some of Ibushi's more divisive work, didn't need to be too real either. Ibushi the wrestler is arguably too committed. This was Ibushi the worker proving himself as a true genius of the old form. He didn't do one single flip throughout that whole entire match because he was too busy trying to convince everybody in the Budokan that he couldn't actually do one because his ankle would not allow for it. So when he finally did overcome that weasel of a heel Jay White, people were actually crying because they've been so gripped by the performances in the ring that they were lost in the action. They didn't care about anything else. This, to them, was about as real as it gets. If the wrestlers are good enough, if the performance is good enough, then the old magic still works. Now, it's only fair that I should probably point out to you that I'm saying these words from the perspective of somebody who likes their pro wrestling, their favourite form of pro wrestling at least, is one that emulates sport in both presentation and athleticism. That's just me. I do also like the other kinds of wrestling, but that is my preferred type of wrestling. The G1 Climax was exactly that. But that's not to say that other forms of wrestling shouldn't exist. That's not to say that other forms of wrestling aren't entertaining, and that's not to say that other forms of wrestling aren't bloody great as well, because they absolutely are, and they absolutely should exist. Another factor at play is that people, generally speaking, don't seem to give a shit about anything anymore. So the same cultural mindset that once drove riots and stabbings no longer exists. In a way, someone like Orange Cassidy is a perfect wrestler for the desensitized meme generation of 2019, as Hulk Hogan was for fans during the aspirational 1980s. At AEW Fyter Fest, MJF cut one of the best heel promos in years, a cruel verbal assault aimed at the stereotypical obese geeks tied to their mom's apron strings. When he mocked these so-called virgins in attendance, the camera captured a man drained of blood where that blood used to boil. So while the very best heel in pro wrestling might suck the soul out of a gamer in 2019, it's fair to say they won't be starting any riots anytime soon. They can, however, if they're good enough, still inspire that fervent reaction. When it comes to clashing of wrestling opinions online from both fans and pros alike, so much time and energy negative energy I should point out, gets wasted on these arguments where they just refuse to accept that people have different opinions, all the while trying to furiously enforce their own opinions on other people. Look at someone like Jay White though. You don't see him steering into these debates on Twitter or trying to tell someone else how to do their job or how they should be doing their job, because he's too busy showing the rest of the world how good he is at doing his own. He's too busy performing and he's too busy creating art, because whether you subscribe to that opinion or not, wrestling is a performance, and what these guys are creating, it's art. So that's it. That's our video on why wrestling is a performance art. I'm sure you got plenty of comments to make about that one, so please be sure to leave them in the comment section down below. Don't forget to like and share. Hit the old subscribe button if you haven't already. You can find the original article for this by Michael Sidgwick. That's at whatculture.com/WWE. You can follow What Culture on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE. You can follow me on Twitter at It's Adam Nicholas. Or if you just want some more videos, there should be some just over here. My name is Adam Nicholas, and I'll see you next time.